The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets still glistened under the amber glow of streetlights, reflecting a city that never quite dried out. Marcus Chun stepped out of his black sedan without waiting for his driver to open the door, a small rebellion against the choreography that governed most of his life. His shoulders ached with the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor but from hours of defending decisions to people who would profit from them regardless. The board meeting had stretched past sunset, each agenda item dissected with surgical precision by men and women who spoke in percentages and projections, their voices smooth and certain. He had nodded at the right moments, signed where his signature was expected, and felt the familiar hollow ache of a day spent managing an empire that no longer surprised him. The cafe was not one he frequented, which was precisely why he chose it. It sat between a laundromat and a bookstore that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the 90s, the kind of neighborhood where wealth passed through but did not linger. The sign above the door read Myra's Place in faded script, and through the window he could see mismatched chairs, tables scarred with years of use, and a chalkboard menu written in looping handwriting. It was the opposite of the steel and glass towers where he spent his days, and that opposition felt like oxygen. Inside, the air smelled of coffee grounds and something baking, perhaps banana bread or cinnamon rolls. A handful of customers occupied the space. A student with headphones buried in a textbook, an older man reading a newspaper with the deliberate slowness of someone with nowhere else to be, a young couple sharing a slice of cake with 2 forks. Marcus chose a table in the corner, away from the window, and sank into the chair with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. For a moment, he simply sat there, letting the quiet hum of ordinary life wash over him. She appeared without fanfare, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and an apron tied at her waist. Her name tag read Elena in bold letters, and her eyes held the particular alertness of someone accustomed to reading a room quickly. She approached with a small notepad and a pen, her movements efficient but not rushed, and when she reached his table she offered a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. Marcus glanced at the menu but did not really see it. "Coffee, black, and whatever you recommend that isn't too sweet." She nodded, jotting down the order. "The almond croissant is good. Not too heavy." "That works." She turned to leave, and perhaps it was the exhaustion, or the way the cafe felt like a pocket of the world where the rules were different, or simply the need to hear a voice that wasn't calculating quarterly earnings, but Marcus heard himself speak before he had fully decided to. "Can I ask you something?" Elena paused, turning back with a slight tilt of her head, curious but cautious. "If you had $10 million to invest," he said, and even as the words left his mouth he recognized the absurdity of the question, the way it must sound coming from a man in a tailored suit asking a waitress in a neighborhood cafe. "What would you do with it?" He had meant it as a joke, a way to break the silence, perhaps even a small test of how people outside his world thought about money when it was hypothetical and vast. He expected a laugh or a dismissive answer about buying a house or traveling the world, the kind of surface-level response that confirmed what he already believed, that most people could not see past their immediate desires. But Elena did not laugh. She did not brush off the question or treat it as the idle musing of a bored customer. Instead, she stood there for a moment, her pen still poised above the notepad, and her expression shifted into something thoughtful, almost solemn. "I would invest in something that lasts longer than I do," she said finally, her voice quiet but certain. "Maybe a scholarship fund for kids who can't afford college. Or a community center in a neighborhood that's been forgotten. Something that doesn't just make money, but makes space for people to grow." She paused, and her eyes met his directly, without hesitation. Because $10 million is not just money. It's a choice about what kind of world you want to leave behind. And I think most people with that much money forget that it's not about them anymore. It's about everyone who comes after. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he had not realized he was wearing. He had asked the question lightly, expecting nothing, and she had answered it with the kind of clarity he had not encountered in years. There was no performance in her words, no attempt to impress or flatter. She spoke as if the question mattered, as if she had thought about it before, and her sincerity was so stark and unguarded that it left him momentarily speechless. Elena seemed to sense the weight of the moment, and after a beat of silence, she offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I'll get your coffee." She walked away, leaving Marcus alone at the corner table, the rain-washed city glowing softly beyond the window. He sat there, hands folded on the table, and realized that for the first time in a very long while, someone had surprised him. Not with charm or cleverness, but with depth. And he did not know what to do with that. Marcus told himself he returned to the cafe because the coffee was better than the expensive blends served in his office, but even he recognized the lie. On the second visit, he ordered the same thing, black coffee and an almond croissant, and sat at the same corner table, his eyes following Elena as she moved through the small space with the kind of efficiency that spoke of years spent navigating tight margins and long hours. She greeted regulars by name, remembered how the older man took his tea, and never wrote down orders for the customers who came in every day. There was a rhythm to her work, a quiet competence that made the cafe feel less like a business and more like an extension of her own careful attention. He came back on the third day, and then the fourth, always at different times, as if varying his schedule would disguise the pattern. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she was not, and on the days when her shift had ended before he arrived, he felt an irrational disappointment that surprised him. He began to notice things. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket that she occasionally pulled out to jot down something between orders, the tiredness that lived in her eyes even when she smiled. It was on the fifth visit, a Tuesday afternoon when the cafe was nearly empty, that he overheard the conversation. Elena was standing near the counter, speaking quietly with the owner, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and an apron dusted with flour. Marcus had his laptop open in front of him, a spreadsheet he was not really looking at, and their voices carried just enough for him to catch fragments. "I can cover the evening shift again if you need me," Elena was saying, her tone matter-of-fact but edged with something that might have been exhaustion. "Daniel's tuition payment is due next week, and I'm still a little short." The owner, Mira, shook her head with a gentleness that spoke of long familiarity. "You're already working doubles 3 times a week, Mija. You're going to burn yourself out." "I'm fine," Elena replied, and Marcus recognized the particular stubbornness of someone who could not afford to be anything else. "Besides, it's only until the end of the semester. After that, Daniel will have his summer job and it'll be easier." Mira sighed, a sound full of maternal concern. "You've been saying that for 2 years. When are you going to do something for yourself?" Elena's smile was small and tired. "When there's time." Marcus kept his eyes on his screen, but his mind was no longer on the numbers. He had assumed, in the casual way people of his world often assumed, that she was a waitress because it was what she had always been, a career chosen or stumbled into without much thought. But the mention of tuition, of covering shifts, of waiting for a future that always seemed just out of reach, painted a different picture entirely. He found himself wanting to know more, not out of idle curiosity, but out of something closer to recognition. Over the following days, he pieced together her story through overheard conversations and the small details that accumulated like sediment. A customer asked her about school, and she mentioned that she had studied economics at the state university before leaving in her junior year. Another regular, a teacher from the neighborhood, commented on how proud her mother would have been to see Daniel doing so well, and Elena's smile faltered just long enough for Marcus to see the grief beneath it. She never volunteered information about herself, but the cafe was a small world, and in small worlds, stories leaked through the cracks. He learned that her mother had been sick for nearly 2 years before she passed, that Elena had been the primary caregiver while trying to balance classes and part-time work, and that eventually something had to give. He learned that Daniel was a sophomore at a community college with plans to transfer to a university, that he was studying engineering, and that Elena spoke about him with a pride so fierce it made Marcus think of his own father, who had never quite understood why his son wanted to build companies instead of fixing engines. What struck Marcus most was not the hardship itself. He knew intellectually that many people lived with far less than he did, but the way Elena carried it. There was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke about her choices, no resentment toward the circumstances that had shaped her life. She did not perform gratitude or resilience for an audience. She simply moved through her days with a quiet determination that seemed almost intrinsic. She was intelligent in a way that had nothing to do with degrees or credentials, her mind sharp and observant, capable of reading people and situations with an accuracy that most of his executives lacked. And she was utterly unimpressed by him. Not hostile, not awed, just indifferent in a way that felt almost radical. She treated him the same way she treated the student with headphones and the teacher and the older man with his newspaper, with courtesy and professionalism, but without the deference that usually followed Marcus wherever he went. She did not ask what he did for a living, did not comment on his expensive watch or his tailored suits, did not adjust her behavior to accommodate his presence. In her world, he was simply another customer, and that anonymity was more valuable to him than any recognition he had received in years. Sitting in the corner of Myra's place, watching Elena navigate her small, difficult, dignified life, Marcus realized something that made him both uncomfortable and strangely hopeful. He envied her. Not her circumstances, but her clarity. She knew what mattered to her, and she lived accordingly, without the layers of compromise and rationalization that had accumulated in his own life like dust. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to understand how. Marcus waited until the afternoon rush had ended and the cafe had settled into the quiet lull between lunch and dinner. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, discarding versions that sounded too corporate, too patronizing, too desperate. The truth was that he did not know how to ask someone like Elena for help without the request sounding like charity dressed in professional language. He had built a career on reading rooms and negotiating terms, but this felt different, more personal, and the stakes were harder to define. Elena was wiping down tables when he approached, her movements methodical and unhurried. She glanced up as he neared, and something in her expression shifted. Not unfriendly, but guarded, as if she had been expecting this conversation and had already decided to be cautious. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low and even. "I'd like to talk to you about something. Not here, if that's okay. Maybe when your shift ends." She straightened, the cloth still in her hand, and studied him with the same careful attention she gave to customers trying to decide between menu items. "Is this about the question you asked me last week?" "In a way," he admitted. "But it's more than that." Elena folded the cloth and set it on the table, her expression unreadable. "I get off in 20 minutes. There's a bench outside the bookstore next door. We can talk there." He nodded, relieved and nervous in equal measure, and returned to his corner table to wait. The 20 minutes stretched longer than they should have, each one filled with the awareness that he was about to ask something that could easily be misunderstood. He thought about the language he would use, the tone he needed to strike, and the likelihood that she would say no. When Elena finally emerged from the cafe, she had removed her apron and pulled on a light jacket against the evening chill. She walked past him without a word, heading toward the bookstore, and Marcus followed, feeling oddly like a supplicant approaching someone whose approval he needed more than he cared to admit. They sat on opposite ends of the bench, a respectful distance between them, and for a moment neither spoke. The street was quiet, the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs and greeted each other by name, and the fading light cast everything in shades of amber and gray. "So," Elena said finally, her voice calm but firm, "what is this about?" Marcus took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to hire you as a consultant, not for your resume or your credentials, but for your perspective. The way you think about investment, about legacy, about what matters. It's something I've lost touch with, and I think it's something I need to find again." Elena's expression did not change, but he saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Skepticism, maybe, or wariness. "You want to hire me because I gave you an answer you liked?" "I want to hire you because you gave me an answer that was real," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I spend my days surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, who speak in projections and percentages, who measure everything by return on investment. And somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started doing this in the first place. You reminded me that money is a choice, not just a number. And I think I need someone who still remembers that." Elena leaned back against the bench, her arms crossed, and he could see her working through the layers of what he was offering. "This sounds like charity," she said quietly. "Like you feel bad for the waitress who works double shifts, and you want to throw money at the problem to make yourself feel better." The accusation stung, not because it was unfair, but because he had worried about the same thing. "I understand why you'd think that," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "And if I were in your position, I'd probably think the same. But this isn't charity. I'm not offering you money because I pity you. I'm offering you a role because I think you see things I've stopped seeing, and I think that perspective is worth something. Not just to me, but to the work I'm trying to do." "And what work is that?" Elena asked, her tone still guarded but edged with curiosity. "I'm developing a community investment fund," Marcus explained. "Something that's supposed to support local businesses, affordable housing, education. But if I'm honest, I don't know if it's actually going to help the people it's meant to help, or if it's just going to be another project that looks good on paper and doesn't change anything. I need someone who understands what real impact looks like. Someone who's lived it." Elena was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the darkening street. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less direct. "I don't have a degree. I don't have experience in consulting or finance or whatever world you live in. What makes you think I could do this?" "Because you don't live in my world," Marcus said simply. "And that's exactly why I'm asking." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and he felt the weight of her assessment. She was trying to decide if he was serious, if this was real, or if it was just another version of the performative generosity she had probably seen before. "I'll meet with you once," she said finally, her words measured and deliberate. "Outside of here, you can explain what you're actually asking for, and I'll decide if it's something I want to be part of. But I'm not agreeing to anything yet. This is just a conversation." Marcus nodded, understanding that this was not acceptance but something more fragile. A willingness to listen, tempered by caution and self-respect. "That's fair. Thank you." Elena stood, pulling her jacket tighter against the evening air. "I'll think about when I'm free and let you know." She walked back toward the cafe without waiting for a response, and Marcus remained on the bench, watching her go. It was not the outcome he had hoped for, but it was not a rejection either. It was a beginning, tentative and uncertain, built on honesty rather than assurances. And for reasons he could not fully explain, that felt like enough. The park was neither large nor particularly beautiful, just a stretch of green space wedged between residential blocks, with a playground at one end and a small pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles. Marcus arrived first, choosing a bench beneath an oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to offer shade without blocking the view. It was Saturday morning, and the park was alive with the ambient sounds of ordinary life. Children laughing on swings, a dog barking in the distance, the rhythmic thud of a basketball against pavement. He had suggested this location precisely because it was neutral, public, a place where neither of them held an advantage. Elena appeared 10 minutes later, walking along the paved path with her hands in the pockets of a worn denim jacket. She moved with the same composed efficiency he had observed at the cafe, her gaze sweeping the park before settling on him. She offered a small nod as she approached, and when she sat down on the opposite end of the bench, she left a careful distance between them, enough to signal that this was still a conversation between near strangers. "Thanks for coming," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I said I would," Elena replied, her tone even. "So, tell me what this is really about." Marcus had prepared for this, but now that the moment had arrived, the practiced words felt insufficient. He looked out at the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water, and decided that honesty was the only currency that would matter here. "I built my first company when I was 26, he began, his voice quiet but steady. "It was a tech startup, nothing revolutionary, just a platform that helped small businesses manage inventory more efficiently. I started it because I was desperate. I had student loans, no job prospects, and a lot of ideas that nobody wanted to fund. So I taught myself to code, worked out of a basement apartment, ate ramen for 2 years straight, and somehow it worked. The company grew, I sold it, and suddenly I had more money than I knew what to do with." He paused, aware that this part of the story was familiar, almost cliché, the bootstrap entrepreneur who makes it big. But what came next was harder to articulate. The thing nobody tells you about that kind of success is how isolating it is, Marcus continued, his gaze still fixed on the water. People started treating me differently. Friends I'd had for years suddenly wanted favors or investments. Family members I hadn't heard from in decades reached out with ideas they wanted me to fund. Every relationship became transactional, even the ones that were supposed to matter. And the new people I met, investors, partners, other entrepreneurs, they didn't care about me. They cared about what I could do for them, or what they could get from associating with me. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable but attentive. Marcus found it easier to talk when he was not looking directly at her, as if the confession required a kind of sidelong approach. I started doing philanthropy because it seemed like the right thing to do, he said. Donating to charities, funding scholarships, showing up at galas where everyone congratulated each other for being generous. But even that felt performative after a while. I wasn't helping people because I cared. I was helping people because it was expected, because it looked good, because it made me feel less guilty about having so much when others had so little. And somewhere in all of that, I lost touch with why I started in the first place. I wanted to build something that mattered, but I ended up building an empire that insulated me from everything real. He turned to look at her then, and found her watching him with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor dismissive. She was simply listening, weighing his words against something internal, and he appreciated the lack of performance in her response. So when you answered my question that day, Marcus said, it wasn't just the content of what you said. It was the fact that you answered it like it mattered, like you'd actually thought about it. And I realized I'd been surrounded by people who never thought about anything beyond their own advantage. I envied that clarity. I still do. Elena was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful but firm. I don't think you should envy me, she said. You're romanticizing struggle, and struggle isn't noble. It's just hard. I didn't leave school because I wanted to. I left because my mother was dying and someone had to take care of her, and I was the only one who could. I worked double shifts because my brother deserves a chance I didn't get, and that's the only way to pay for it. There's no clarity in that. There's just necessity. Marcus absorbed her words, recognizing the truth in them. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it sound like hardship is something to aspire to. But you're not entirely wrong either, Elena continued, her tone softening slightly. There is something that comes from living close to the edge. You learn what matters because you don't have the luxury of pretending everything matters equally. You make choices, and those choices have weight. Maybe that's what you're looking for, not struggle, but stakes. Something where your decisions actually cost you something. The observation landed with the kind of precision that made Marcus pause. She had named something he had felt but could not articulate, the sense that his life had become consequence-free, that every choice was reversible, every mistake cushioned by enough resources to make it disappear. I think you're right, he said quietly. I don't know when I stopped feeling like my choices mattered, but I want to find that again. Elena nodded slowly, and for the first time since they sat down, the distance between them felt less like caution and more like mutual respect. If I agree to work with you, she said, it's not going to be easy. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear, and I'm not going to pretend your money solves everything. If we're doing this, we're doing it honestly. I wouldn't want it any other way, Marcus replied. They sat in silence for a moment, the park continuing its gentle rhythm around them. It was not friendship yet, but it was the beginning of something, a foundation built on honesty rather than illusion, on mutual recognition rather than transaction. And that, Marcus thought, was more valuable than any deal he had closed in years. Elena spent the first week doing what Marcus had not expected. She read everything. Not just the glossy overview documents his team had prepared, with their carefully curated statistics and projected outcomes, but the raw data beneath them. She requested census reports for the neighborhoods the fund was targeting, historical property values, demographic shifts over the past decade. She asked for contact information for community leaders and spent her evenings after shifts at the cafe making phone calls, asking questions, listening to voices that rarely appeared in boardroom presentations. Marcus watched this process with a mixture of admiration and unease. He had given her access to the files because he had promised transparency, but he had not anticipated the thoroughness with which she would dissect them. She approached the project like an investigator, and he began to realize that inviting her perspective meant inviting scrutiny he was not entirely prepared for. They met in his office on a Thursday afternoon, a space of glass and steel on the 32nd floor with a view that stretched across the city like a promise. Elena arrived in jeans and a sweater, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and she looked profoundly out of place among the leather chairs and abstract art. She set a folder on the conference table and opened it without preamble, her expression serious. "I need to talk to you about the Riverside project," she said, and something in her tone made Marcus's stomach tighten. He had reviewed the Riverside development himself weeks ago, a partnership with a firm specializing in urban renewal. The plan was to purchase several blocks of aging apartment buildings, renovate them, and attract new businesses to the area. On paper, it was exactly the kind of revitalization the fund was supposed to support. But as Elena spread out her research, maps marked with displacement patterns, interviews with current residents, projections of rent increases, he began to see the silhouette of something darker beneath the polished language. "Your partner is calling this revitalization," Elena said, her voice calm but edged with something harder. "But what they're actually doing is pricing out everyone who currently lives there. They're buying properties at below-market rates, promising improvements, and then raising rents by 40% once the work is done. The people who've lived in that neighborhood for decades, families, small business owners, elderly residents on fixed incomes, they won't be able to afford to stay. This isn't investment. It's displacement with better marketing." Marcus felt the instinctive need to defend the project, to explain the economic logic, the job creation, the long-term benefits. "The buildings are in poor condition," he said, hearing the stiffness in his own voice. "They need significant repairs. The current landlords aren't maintaining them. We're offering residents temporary relocation assistance and priority access to the renovated units. At rents they can't afford," Elena countered, her eyes steady on his. "I spoke to a woman named Carmen who's lived in one of those buildings for 22 years. She raises her granddaughter there. She works as a home health aide and makes $19 an hour. After the renovation, her rent would go from $800 a month to $1,300. She can't pay that. And the temporary relocation assistance you mentioned is 3 months. 3 months to find a new place in a city where affordable housing barely exists. So where does Carmen go? Where does her granddaughter go to school? This project isn't helping people like her. It's erasing them." The words landed like stones, each one precise and heavy. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath the justifications he had accepted without question. He thought about the presentations he had sat through, the partner who had assured him this was good for the community, the metrics that measured success in property values rather than human lives. He had trusted the expertise of people who spoke his language, and in doing so, he had stopped asking the questions that mattered. "I didn't know," he said quietly, and even as he spoke, he recognized how inadequate the defense was. "Maybe you didn't," Elena said, and her tone softened slightly, though her gaze remained unwavering. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You have the resources to know, and you didn't look. You trusted people who have a financial interest in not telling you the whole truth. And now you have to decide what you're going to do about it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the choice settling over him. His partners were expecting a decision by the end of the week. The project had momentum, contracts in negotiation, investors ready to commit capital. Pulling out now would raise questions, damage relationships, potentially cost him credibility in circles where credibility was everything. But sitting across from Elena, looking at the maps and interviews and faces of people he had never met but whose lives his decisions would shape, he could not ignore what she was showing him. "What would you do?" he asked, not as a deflection but as a genuine question. "I would stop it," Elena said without hesitation. "Or I would restructure it completely, cap the rent increases, guarantee current residents can stay, include them in the planning process instead of treating them like obstacles." And if your partners won't agree to that, then I would walk away. Because if this fund is supposed to be about community investment, it has to actually serve the community. Not just the version of the community you want to create. Marcus looked out at the city beyond the glass, the sprawl of buildings and lives and choices layered upon choices. He thought about the easier path, the one where he signed the contracts and moved forward and told himself that progress required difficult compromises. And he thought about the person he had been when he started his first company, working out of a basement with nothing but conviction and a belief that what he was building mattered. "I need more time," he said finally, the words feeling both heavy and necessary. "I'm going to delay the deal. Tell my partners we're conducting additional due diligence. And I'm going to sit down with them and explain why this isn't acceptable as it stands." Elena's expression shifted, something close to respect flickering across her features. "That's going to be hard." "I know," Marcus said, "but you're right. If I'm going to do this, I have to do it honestly. And that starts now." She nodded, closing the folder with a quiet finality. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of a decision that truly mattered. The conference call had the sterile quality of all difficult conversations conducted through screens, faces arranged in neat rectangles, voices flattened by compression algorithms. Marcus sat alone in his office, the city stretching out behind him in the late afternoon light, and listened as his partners expressed their concerns with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed frustration. Richard Moss, who had been with the fund since its inception, spoke first, his tone measured but pointed. "Marcus, I understand you want to be thorough, but we've already spent considerable time on due diligence. The Riverside project has been vetted by our legal team, our financial analysts, and our community outreach consultants. Delaying now sends a message to our investors that we're indecisive, and indecision in this market is expensive." "I'm not being indecisive," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm being responsible. There are concerns about displacement that weren't adequately addressed in the initial assessments. We need to restructure the proposal to ensure current residents aren't priced out of their own neighborhood." Another partner, Jennifer Lau, leaned closer to her camera, her expression skeptical. "With all due respect, Marcus, that's not economically viable. If we cap rent increases the way you're suggesting, the returns won't justify the investment. Our stakeholders didn't commit capital to break even. They committed because we promised competitive returns alongside social impact. And what kind of social impact are we delivering if we displace the very people we claim to be helping?" Marcus asked, and he heard the sharpness in his own voice. "This isn't about being naive. It's about being honest about what we're doing." There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy even through digital space, and then Richard spoke again, his tone softer but more dangerous. "Marcus, there are rumors circulating. People are saying you've brought in an outside consultant with no credentials, someone who's influencing decisions beyond her expertise. I'm not questioning your judgment, but I am asking you to consider how this looks. We've built this fund on credibility, and right now that credibility is being questioned." Marcus felt the anger rise in his chest, not because the accusation was unfair, but because it revealed how quickly principle could be dismissed as weakness. He thought about Elena sitting in diners and community centers, talking to people his team had never bothered to meet, and he felt a protective instinct that surprised him. "Her perspective is exactly what we've been missing," Marcus said firmly. "And if our investors can't see the value in that, then maybe we need different investors." The call ended shortly after, with vague assurances that they would revisit the conversation next week. But Marcus knew what had been communicated beneath the professional language. He was being watched. His judgment was under scrutiny, and if he continued down this path, there would be consequences. He learned about Elena's situation 3 days later, not from her, but from Mira, who called him at the cafe during what must have been a slow afternoon. Her voice was worried, maternal, and direct. "I don't know if Elena would want me telling you this," Mira said, "but her hours got cut. Luis, the new shift manager, he's young and ambitious, and he doesn't like that she's been doing work outside the cafe. Says it's a distraction, says she's not committed. It's nonsense, of course. Elena works harder than anyone I've ever hired, but he has the authority, and now she's short on rent. I thought you should know, since you're the one who offered her that consulting job." Marcus felt the weight of unintended consequences settle over him. He had invited Elena into his world, had asked for her honesty, and now she was paying for it in ways he had not anticipated. He called her that evening, and when she answered, her voice was tired but composed. "Mira told you," Elena said, "not quite a question." "She's worried about you," Marcus replied. "So am I. Let me help. I can cover your rent, or I can pay you a retainer for the consulting work so you have steady income while we figure this out." There was a long silence, and when Elena spoke again, her voice was firm in a way that left no room for negotiation. "No, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not taking money from you like that. This isn't your fault, and I'm not going to turn this into something where I owe you. I'll figure it out. I always do." "Elena, this is my fault," Marcus insisted, frustration bleeding into his tone. "I brought you into this, and now you're dealing with consequences because of it. Let me at least—" "Marcus, stop," she interrupted, and the sharpness in her voice cut through his argument. "If you pay my rent, if you give me money outside of actual work, then what we're building here changes. It stops being a partnership and starts being charity. And I won't do that. Not with you, not with anyone. I need to know that I'm standing on my own, that my voice matters because of what I bring, not because I'm dependent on you. Do you understand?" He did understand, even if he hated it. He recognized the pride in her refusal, the same pride that had carried her through years of impossible choices, and he knew that pushing would only insult what they were trying to build. "I understand," he said quietly, "but if you change your mind—" "I won't," Elena said, her tone softening slightly. "But thank you for respecting that." After they hung up, Marcus sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, the city lights flickering to life beyond the windows. He thought about the pressure from his partners, the rumors circulating through professional circles, the careful distance Elena maintained even as they grew closer. He had expected resistance when he invited her perspective, but he had not fully grasped the personal cost, for both of them. And yet, despite the friction and the consequences, he did not regret the decision. Elena's refusal to accept his help was not stubbornness. It was integrity. She understood something he was only beginning to learn. That respect required boundaries, that trust was built through mutual autonomy rather than dependence. She would not let him rescue her, because being rescued would undermine everything she was trying to teach him. Sitting in the quiet of his expensive apartment, Marcus realized that the discomfort he felt, the pressure from partners, the helplessness in the face of Elena's struggle, was not a sign that he was making the wrong choice. It was a sign that he was finally making choices that mattered. And that weight, that consequence, was exactly what he had been missing. The invitation had arrived in a simple envelope, Marcus's handwriting neat and deliberate on the card inside. He had framed it carefully when he handed it to her at the cafe. A colleague attending a work event, nothing more. The annual Chin Foundation Gala, an evening of networking and charitable commitments, and he thought it might be useful for her to see how these things operated. Elena had accepted with visible reluctance, aware that refusing would seem like fear, but equally aware that she was walking into a world where she did not belong. She borrowed a black dress from Myra's daughter, simple and appropriate but clearly not expensive, and stood in front of her bathroom mirror feeling like an imposter. The dress fit well enough, but it could not disguise what she was. A waitress playing at sophistication, about to spend an evening surrounded by people whose monthly expenses exceeded her annual income. She thought about canceling, inventing an excuse, but she had told Marcus she would come, and Elena Morales did not break her word. The venue was a hotel ballroom downtown, all crystal chandeliers and marble floors, the kind of space designed to make wealth feel like art. Women in gowns that cost more than Elena's rent moved through the crowd with practiced grace, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter polished and perfectly timed. Men in tuxedos gathered in clusters, drinks in hand, speaking in the coded language of business, mergers and acquisitions, market disruptions, portfolio diversification. Elena felt the stares as she entered, subtle but unmistakable, the momentary assessments that placed her outside the circle of belonging. Marcus found her near the entrance, and the relief in his expression was genuine. He wore his tuxedo with the ease of someone accustomed to formal events, but there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested discomfort beneath the polished surface. He offered her his arm, a gesture that felt protective rather than romantic, and guided her into the crowd. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I know this isn't your scene." "It's definitely not," Elena replied, her voice low. "But I'm curious. You live in this world. I want to understand it." What she observed over the next 2 hours was a masterclass in performance. Conversations were brief and strategic, each exchange calculated for maximum social return. People spoke about philanthropy with the same transactional language they used for investments, tax benefits, branding opportunities, networking access. A woman in emerald silk described her foundation's work in education with enthusiasm that seemed rehearsed, and when Elena asked a follow-up question about outcomes, the woman's smile faltered, her answer vague and defensive. No one seemed genuinely interested in anyone else. They were interested in what others represented, what connections could be leveraged, what associations could be cultivated. And Marcus moved through it all with a practiced fluidity that both impressed and saddened her. She watched him laugh at jokes that were not funny, compliment projects he likely knew nothing about, and accept gratitude for donations that were, she suspected, more about optics than impact. He was performing, just as everyone else was, and the mask he wore was so seamless that she wondered if he even noticed it anymore. It was only later, when the speeches had concluded and the crowd had thinned slightly, that Marcus steered her toward a quiet corner of the venue where a small cafe setup offered coffee and desserts. They sat at a table tucked away from the main floor, and for the first time all evening, Elena saw the tension leave his face. "That was exhausting," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I forget how much energy it takes to be in those rooms." "You're good at it," Elena said, and it was not quite a compliment. "I've had practice," Marcus replied, his tone resigned. "But it's all theater. None of those conversations meant anything. They'll forget we talked by tomorrow." Elena sipped her coffee, watching him across the small table. "Is this what you thought success would look like? When you were starting out, building that first company? Did you imagine this?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "No," he said finally. "I thought success would feel like freedom, like I'd have choices, like I'd be able to do work that mattered without constantly worrying about money. But somewhere along the way, the money became the point, and the work became secondary. And now I'm stuck in rooms like this, performing for people I don't even like, because that's what you do when you have wealth and influence. You show up, you play the part." Elena thought about her own life, the shifts at the cafe, the careful budgeting, the constant awareness of how little margin for error she had. "I used to envy people like you," she said honestly. "I thought money solved everything. But watching you tonight, I realized it just creates different problems. You're trapped by what you have, the same way I'm trapped by what I don't have." "My father would have said the same thing," Marcus said, and something in his voice shifted, became quieter and more vulnerable. "He worked in a factory for 37 years. Assembly line. When I told him I was dropping out of my MBA program to start a company, he thought I was insane. He believed in steady paychecks, pensions, loyalty to employers who didn't care about him. We fought about it constantly, and when the company succeeded, when I made my first million, I thought he'd finally understand. But he didn't. He just looked at me like I'd become someone he didn't recognize. We barely spoke after that. He died 5 years ago, and I don't think he ever understood what I was trying to build." Elena felt the weight of that loss, the specific pain of being unseen by someone whose approval you desperately wanted. "My mother had dreams," she said softly. "She wanted to be a teacher. She was brilliant, could have done anything, but she got pregnant with me at 19, and that was the end of those plans. She never resented me for it, at least she never said so, but I always knew. When she got sick in those last months, she kept apologizing. For not being able to help me finish school, for being a burden, for not becoming the person she'd wanted to be. I told her it didn't matter, that I loved her, but I don't think she believed me. I think she died feeling like she'd failed." Marcus reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough that the gesture registered. You didn't fail her. You gave up your own dreams to take care of her. That's not failure. But her dreams are still unfulfilled, Elena said, and her voice caught slightly. And sometimes I wonder if I'm living my life or just managing the consequences of hers. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the gala distant and muted, two people from different worlds recognizing the same shape of grief. Marcus, who had succeeded beyond measure but lost his father's understanding in the process. Elena, who had sacrificed her own path to honor her mother's needs, but carried the weight of unfulfilled potential. Their circumstances were opposite, but the wound was the same. The ache of being misunderstood, of choices that cost more than they should have, of love tangled with regret. I'm glad you're here, Marcus said finally. Not at the gala. I mean, working with me, challenging me. I don't think I realized how isolated I'd become until you showed me what I'd stopped seeing. Elena met his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, but recognition. A shared understanding that their worlds, which had seemed so separate, were intersecting in ways neither had anticipated. And in that intersection, something new was taking shape. The restructuring took 3 months, and every week brought new resistance. Marcus's partners argued that he was sacrificing returns for ideology, that the revised model would never attract serious investors, that he was letting sentiment override sound business strategy. He listened to their objections with a patience he had not known he possessed, and then he made his decisions anyway. He divested completely from the Riverside gentrification project, absorbing the financial penalty for early withdrawal, and redirected that capital into 3 initiatives Elena had helped design. An affordable housing preservation fund that purchased aging buildings and kept rents stable, a small business grant program that prioritized neighborhood entrepreneurs over corporate franchises, and an educational scholarship fund that covered not just tuition but living expenses for students like Daniel, who carried their family's hopes on their shoulders. The financial projections were modest at best. Where the original fund had promised 12% annual returns, the restructured model offered 6, maybe 7 if everything went well. 2 of Marcus's original investors withdrew, citing philosophical differences that were really just disappointment that their money would not multiply as quickly as they had hoped. But others stayed, and a few new investors came in, people who had been watching from a distance, waiting to see if Marcus's shift in direction was genuine or performative. The fund was smaller now, leaner, but it felt more honest, and that honesty was something Marcus had not realized he was hungry for until he tasted it. Elena attended the meetings where they reviewed the first round of grant recipients, sitting at the conference table with a notebook and a quiet intensity that the other advisors had learned to respect. She asked questions that cut through jargon, questioned assumptions that everyone else had accepted as fact, and when the committee approved funding for a Salvadoran woman named Rosa who wanted to expand her tamale business into a small restaurant, Elena's smile was the kind that came from deep satisfaction rather than politeness. Afterward, Marcus drove Elena to see some of the projects in person, something he had never done with previous investments. They visited a 4-story apartment building in a neighborhood where trees lined the streets and children played on stoops, the kind of place that developers called underutilized and residents called home. The building had been slated for demolition before the fund purchased it, and now it was undergoing careful renovations that preserved affordability while addressing years of neglect. They met the property manager, a man named James who had lived in the building for 15 years, and he walked them through the improvements with a pride that was contagious. New windows that actually sealed against winter cold, updated electrical systems that did not spark and fail, a community room in the basement that residents could use for gatherings. People don't understand what stability means until they've lived without it, James said as they stood in the building's small courtyard, where someone had planted tomatoes in wooden boxes. Most of us here, we've been pushed out of other neighborhoods. Rents went up, buildings got sold, and suddenly we didn't belong anymore. This place, knowing we can stay, knowing our kids can stay, it changes how you think about the future. Elena listened with an attention that was almost reverent, and Marcus watched her absorb James's words like someone taking notes on something sacred. After they left, as they drove through streets where murals decorated brick walls and corner stores sold groceries in languages Marcus did not speak, Elena was quiet for a long time. "I didn't think this was possible," she said finally, her voice soft. "I thought people with money either hoarded it or spent it on things that made them feel good but didn't actually change anything. But this, what we're doing, it's real. Those people in that building, Rosa with her restaurant, the kids who'll get scholarships, they're not abstract concepts. They're lives that are different because of choices we made." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with purpose. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, and it was not flattery but simple truth. "I would have kept funding projects that looked good on paper and ignored the people they were supposed to help. You taught me to ask different questions. You were willing to learn," Elena replied. "That's rarer than you think." Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself thinking less about quarterly projections and more about the stories behind the numbers. He read the applications for scholarships and saw his younger self in some of them. The desperation, the hunger, the belief that education was a ladder out of circumstances that felt immovable. He visited small businesses that received grants and listened to owners describe what the money meant. The ability to hire an employee, to fix a broken oven, to finally take a day off without worrying that everything would collapse. The returns were modest, yes, but the return on meaning was immeasurable. And somewhere in that process, his relationship with Elena changed in ways that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They spoke on the phone late at night, conversations that started with fun business and drifted into personal territory. Books they had read, music that mattered to them, memories that shaped who they had become. They met for coffee at Myra's place, and the cafe felt less like neutral ground and more like shared space. Marcus found himself seeking her opinion not just on investment decisions but on everything, and Elena, who had guarded her trust so carefully, began to let him see the parts of herself she usually kept hidden. Her doubts, her fears, her quiet hope that maybe the world could be different than she had been taught to expect. They did not name what was forming between them, perhaps because naming it would require decisions neither was ready to make. But they both felt it, the shift from alliance to partnership, from respect to something warmer and more vulnerable. Marcus, who had spent years surrounded by transactional relationships, discovered what it meant to be seen by someone who cared about his choices more than his wealth. Elena, who had learned to expect disappointment from people with power, began to believe that maybe, in the right hands, wealth could be a tool for justice rather than extraction. Sitting in his office one evening, reviewing impact reports that measured success in lives changed rather than dollars multiplied, Marcus realized that the validation he had sought from investors and boards had been hollow all along. The satisfaction he felt now, modest, unglamorous, deeply human, was what he had been searching for without knowing it. And the person who had helped him find it was someone he had met by accident, in a cafe where he had asked a question he had not expected anyone to answer honestly. It was not the future he had imagined, but it was better. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Elena found it waiting on the kitchen table when she came home from her evening shift. The envelope already opened, Daniel's hands shaking slightly as he held the single page. He looked up at her with an expression caught between elation and terror, and she knew before he spoke what the letter contained and what it would cost. "I got in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Full acceptance. Engineering program. They want me to start in the fall." Elena felt pride and panic collide in her chest. She crossed the small kitchen and pulled him into a hug, feeling how tall he had gotten, how much he had grown from the kid she used to walk to elementary school. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. "You worked so hard for this." Daniel pulled back, and she saw the worry etched into his features, the awareness that had lived with both of them for years. The gap between dreams and affordability. "The financial aid package covers about half," he said quietly. "I'd need to take out loans for the rest. A lot of loans. And even then, there's living expenses, books, transportation. I don't know if we can do this, Elena." She forced her expression into something calm and reassuring, even as her mind raced through calculations she had already run 100 times before. Her savings were depleted from helping with their mother's final medical bills. Her hours at the cafe were still reduced. The consulting work with Marcus paid, but not enough to cover tuition at a private university. She could take out loans herself, co-sign for him, but the weight of that debt would follow them both for decades. "We'll figure it out," she said. The words automatic, a promise she had made so many times it felt like prayer. "Don't worry about the money. Just focus on getting ready. This is your chance, and we're not letting it slip away." But after Daniel went to bed, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the acceptance letter and feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices. She thought about calling Marcus, about asking if the scholarship fund could help, but the thought made her stomach tighten with something close to shame. She had worked so hard to maintain boundaries, to keep their relationship professional, to prove that she was not someone who needed rescuing. Asking for help now would undermine everything she had tried to build. So she said nothing, and tried to carry the worry silently. Marcus learned about Daniel's acceptance not from Elena but from Mira, who mentioned it casually during one of his visits to the cafe. Her voice filled with the kind of pride that surrogate family carries. "That boy is going to do amazing things," Mira said, refilling his coffee. Elena must be beside herself with joy and terror knowing her. That kind of tuition is no joke. Marcus felt something click into place, a puzzle piece he had not realized was missing. Elena had been distracted lately, quieter during their meetings, and he had attributed it to exhaustion. But now he understood. He spent the rest of the day thinking about what to do, aware that any offer of help would be complicated by the power dynamics they had worked so carefully to navigate. He approached it through the fund's scholarship committee, proposing Daniel as a candidate based on merit and need, making sure the decision went through proper channels rather than executive decree. The committee approved the application unanimously. Daniel's grades and recommendations spoke for themselves, and Marcus arranged for the award to be processed anonymously, structured as a standard scholarship rather than a personal gift. But Elena was too observant to miss the timing, and too familiar with the fund's processes to believe in coincidence. She called Marcus 2 days after Daniel received the notification, her voice tight with an emotion he could not quite identify. "We need to talk," she said. "In person, not at the cafe." They met at the same park bench where they had first discussed working together, the evening air cool and heavy with the scent of coming rain. Elena sat with her arms crossed, her posture defensive, and when she spoke, her words were careful and measured. "I know what you did," she said. "The scholarship for Daniel came through right after Mira mentioned it to you. That's not coincidence." Marcus did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "The committee approved it based on his application. I didn't override their decision. I just made sure they considered it." "Why?" Elena asked, and there was something raw in her voice. "Why would you do that without talking to me first?" "Because I knew you wouldn't ask," Marcus said quietly. "And I knew you'd refuse if I offered directly. But Elena, this is exactly what the fund is for. This is the work we've been doing, supporting students who deserve opportunities they can't afford. Daniel is brilliant. He should go to that university. And the fund can make that possible." Elena looked away, her jaw tight, and he could see the war happening inside her. Gratitude battling with fear, pride wrestling with need. "I don't want to be indebted to you," she said finally. "I don't want our relationship to become something where I owe you, where every conversation has that weight underneath it." "This isn't debt," Marcus said, and he leaned forward slightly, willing her to hear him. "This is investment. That's the whole point of what we're building, isn't it? To invest in people who will use that support to build something meaningful. Daniel is going to be an engineer. He's going to create things, solve problems, maybe help people the way we're trying to help people now. That's not charity. That's multiplying impact." Elena turned back to him, her eyes searching his face for something. Dishonesty, pity, anything that would justify her resistance. But what she found was sincerity, and that made the decision harder, not easier. "I've spent my whole life making sure I don't need anyone," she said, her voice softer now. "Because needing people means they have power over you. And I've seen what happens when people have that power. They use it. They hold it over you. They make you feel small." "I'm not trying to have power over you," Marcus said. "I'm trying to be your partner. And partners help each other. Not because one is better or stronger, but because that's what partnership means. Elena was quiet for a long time, and Marcus waited, giving her the space to work through the tangle of emotions he could see playing across her features. Finally, she took a slow breath and nodded, just slightly. "Okay," she said. "Daniel can accept the scholarship, but I need you to understand something. This doesn't change what we are to each other. We're still equals. This is the fund doing what it's supposed to do, not you rescuing me. Can you accept that?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "That's exactly what it is." Something eased in Elena's posture then, the tension bleeding out of her shoulders. She did not smile, but the hardness in her expression softened into something closer to relief. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding why this is complicated, and for doing it anyway." They sat in silence as the first drops of rain began to fall, neither moving to leave, both aware that something had shifted between them. Trust, already present, had deepened into something more resilient. And for Elena, who had spent so long believing that accepting help meant surrendering autonomy, the realization that she could be supported without being diminished felt like a kind of freedom she had not known existed. The change in Marcus was gradual enough that he did not notice it himself at first, but others did. In meetings, he began pausing before responding to proposals, asking questions that no one expected. Who benefits from this? What voices are missing from this conversation? What does success look like for the people this will affect, not just for our investors? His team adapted, some with enthusiasm, others with thinly veiled frustration. The executives who had worked with him for years recognized that something fundamental had shifted, though they disagreed about whether it was growth or regression. The board noticed too. At the quarterly review in late spring, Marcus presented the fund's performance with a transparency that bordered on uncomfortable. The returns were modest, 6.3% over the previous year, well below the industry standard but steady. More importantly, the impact metrics told a different story. 300 families remained in affordable housing who would have been displaced. 42 small businesses received grants that allowed them to survive and expand. 18 students like Daniel were attending universities they could not have afforded otherwise. Marcus spoke about these outcomes with a conviction that made some board members nod approvingly and others shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was Gerald Whitmore, a venture capitalist who had been one of the fund's earliest investors, who voiced what others were thinking. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no, and when he spoke, his tone was paternalistic and pointed. "Marcus, I appreciate the passion," Gerald said, his voice smooth and controlled. "But passion doesn't pay dividends. Our fiduciary responsibility is to our investors, and frankly, these returns are unacceptable. You've restructured the fund based on what I can only describe as sentimental criteria, and while I understand the appeal of feel-good stories, we're in the business of generating wealth, not running a charity. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. I think it's time we brought in leadership that understands what this fund was created to do." The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes rupture. Marcus felt the familiar instinct to defend himself with numbers and projections, to argue that long-term sustainability justified short-term modesty. But before he could speak, Elena's voice cut through the tension. She had been sitting at the far end of the table, invited to attend as a consultant but not expected to participate in board deliberations. Her presence had already raised eyebrows. Several board members had questioned Marcus privately about why someone without credentials was being given access to executive discussions. But now she leaned forward, her posture calm and her voice steady, and the authority in her tone came not from position but from clarity. "If I may," Elena said, and though it was phrased as a request, it carried the weight of someone who would speak regardless of permission. "I've reviewed the fund's performance over the past 5 years, both before and after the restructuring, and I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what constitutes success here." Gerald's expression tightened, but he gestured for her to continue, the kind of dismissive courtesy that suggested he was humoring her. Elena pulled out a tablet and displayed a series of charts on the conference room screen. Before restructuring, the fund averaged 11% annual returns. Impressive on paper. But 70% of that capital was invested in projects that displaced low-income residents, gentrified neighborhoods, and prioritized corporate franchises over local businesses. The wealth generated went almost entirely to investors and developers. The communities these projects claimed to help saw increased rents, decreased access to services, and net loss of long-term residents. That's not sustainable impact. That's extraction with better marketing. She advanced to the next slide, showing data Marcus recognized from her research, demographic shifts, displacement patterns, economic outcomes for affected communities. After restructuring, returns dropped to 6.3%. But 100% of the capital is now invested in projects that stabilize rather than displace communities. The wealth generated stays local. Small businesses reinvest in their neighborhoods. Families remain in stable housing, which improves educational outcomes for their children, which increases long-term economic mobility. These are measurable outcomes with compounding benefits. If you're measuring success purely by immediate financial returns, then yes, we're underperforming. But if you're measuring success by what this fund was publicly stated to accomplish, community investment and sustainable impact, then we're finally doing what we claim to be doing all along. She paused, her gaze moving deliberately around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether you invested in this fund because you believed in its stated mission, or because you wanted high returns and liked the branding of social responsibility. Because you can't have both. Not honestly. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more uncomfortable. Several board members looked away, and Marcus saw something he had not expected. Shame. Not in everyone. Gerald's expression had hardened into resentment, but in enough faces to matter. One of the other investors, a woman named Claudia Reyes who ran a sustainable investment firm, spoke up. I think Elena makes a compelling case. I invested in this fund specifically because Marcus promised community-centered impact. If that mission has finally become real rather than aspirational, then I'm satisfied with modest returns. I'd rather earn 6% on investments that align with my values than 12% on projects that undermine them. Another board member nodded in agreement, and then another. The momentum shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly. And when the vote came, Gerald's motion failed by a significant margin. Marcus retained his position, the restructured fund maintained its direction, and Gerald left the meeting with the tight-lipped silence of someone unaccustomed to losing. After the board dispersed, Marcus found Elena in the hallway outside the conference room, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, looking exhausted. He approached quietly, and when she opened her eyes, he saw the toll the confrontation had taken. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did, Elena replied. Because what we're building matters. And if I'm going to be part of it, I'm going to defend it. Not just to be nice, but because the data supports it. This isn't idealism. It's strategy. Marcus felt something settle in his chest. A realization that had been forming for weeks but crystallized in that moment. Elena was not an outsider offering naive ideals. She was a strategist who understood both the human and the economic dimensions of their work, and her perspective was not sentimental. It was sophisticated in ways that traditional metrics failed to capture. I used to think impact and profit were separate goals, Marcus said quietly. That you had to choose between doing good and doing well. But you've shown me they're not separate. They're just measured differently. And the people who can't see that are the ones who've never had to live with the consequences of their investments. Elena pushed off the wall, straightening her shoulders. You're learning, she said, and there was something almost affectionate in her tone. Slowly, but you're learning. They walked toward the elevator together, and Marcus realized that what had started as an unusual consulting arrangement had become something far more significant. Elena was not just advising him, she was reshaping how he understood his own work. And in defending him to the board, she had claimed a place in his world not as a guest but as an equal. The shift in perception was complete. She was no longer the waitress who had surprised him with an honest answer. She was his partner, and he could not imagine doing this work without her. The cafe closed early on Sundays, the chairs stacked on tables by 7, the chalkboard menu erased and waiting for Monday's specials. But Mira had given Elena a key years ago, and on this particular evening in late summer, Elena let herself and Marcus in through the back door, flipping on only half the lights so the space glowed softly in the gathering dusk. It was Marcus who had suggested they meet here, in the place where everything had started, and Elena had agreed without asking why. Some conversations required specific geography, places where the past and present could overlap. They sat at the same corner table where Marcus had first asked his question months ago, though now the worn surface felt less like neutral ground and more like something they shared. Elena had brought coffee from the machine behind the counter, made the way she knew he liked it, black, strong, no sugar, and Marcus cradled the mug between his hands as if warming himself against something other than temperature. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of Sunday evening stillness that settles over neighborhoods where people have lived long enough to know each other's routines. A couple walked past with a dog, their laughter muted through the glass. A car drove by slowly, music bleeding from open windows. The city continued its gentle rhythm, indifferent to the weight of what was about to be said. "I've been thinking about that first day," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence. "When I asked you what you'd do with $10 million. I've been thinking about why I asked that question." Elena looked at him over the rim of her cup, waiting. She had learned that Marcus sometimes needed space to work through his thoughts aloud, that the pauses between his words mattered as much as the words themselves. "I told myself it was a joke," Marcus continued, his gaze fixed on the table. "Just something to fill the silence, to be charming or clever or whatever. But that wasn't true. I was testing something. Testing you, maybe, or testing the world. I'd spent the entire day in meetings with people who said exactly what they thought I wanted to hear, who performed authenticity so well I couldn't tell what was real anymore. And I was exhausted by it. So I asked you that question because part of me was desperate to hear something honest, even if I didn't know I was desperate until you answered." Elena set her cup down carefully, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. "I remember that moment," she said quietly. "You asked it like you expected me to laugh it off or say something superficial. But I didn't hear it as a joke. I heard it as a real question, and I've been carrying an answer to that question for years." Marcus looked up, surprised. "You had?" "Of course I had," Elena said, and there was something both sad and defiant in her voice. "When you spend your whole life one emergency away from catastrophe, you think about money differently. Not because you're greedy, but because you're trying to survive. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep because I was worried about rent or my mother's medical bills or Daniel's tuition, I'd let myself imagine what I'd do if money wasn't the obstacle. Not winning the lottery fantasies, but real questions about what mattered. What would I build if I could? What would I protect? What kind of world would I try to create?" She paused, her fingers tracing the handle of her cup. "So when you asked me that question, it wasn't spontaneous. It was the answer I'd been rehearsing in the dark for years, waiting for someone to actually care enough to ask." The honesty of it settled between them like something tangible. Marcus felt the weight of all the assumptions he had made, about her, about people in her circumstances, about what they thought and wanted and understood. He had believed his wealth gave him perspective, but Elena had been thinking about investment and legacy and impact long before they met. Not from a position of power, but from a position of clarity born from necessity. "I didn't expect to meet you," Marcus said, and his voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "I didn't expect any of this. When I walked into this cafe that first day, I was just looking for somewhere quiet where no one knew who I was. And then you answered my question and something shifted. I don't know how to describe it except to say that you made me remember who I used to be before I became successful. Before I learned to perform instead of feel. You made me believe something I'd stopped believing," Elena replied. "That people with power could choose differently. That wealth didn't have to be a wall between people but could be a bridge, if someone cared enough to build it right." She met his eyes, and there was vulnerability in her gaze that she rarely allowed anyone to see. "I've spent my whole life being invisible to people like you. Not because you're cruel, but because you live in a different world and people like me are just background. But you saw me, you listened, and that changed everything." Marcus reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough that the gesture registered. An offering, a question, a recognition of the space between them that had somehow become sacred. "I don't know what to call this," he said. "What we are to each other. It's not just professional, but it's not. I don't know. I just know that you've changed the way I see everything. The work I do, the choices I make, the person I want to be. And I don't think I can go back to who I was before I met you." Elena looked at their hands, almost touching, separated by inches that felt both vast and insignificant. "I don't think we need to name it," she said quietly. "Maybe it's enough to know that it matters. That we matter to each other in ways that don't fit into easy categories. A billionaire and a waitress, brought together by a question neither of us expected to ask or answer honestly. It's unlikely, it's strange, but it's real. It's the most real thing in my life," Marcus said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. They sat in the dimming light of the cafe, the city continuing its evening rituals beyond the glass, and neither felt the need to say anything more. The question that had brought them together, "What would you do with $10 million?" had been answered not in words but in choices, in the months of work and trust and gradual transformation they had built together. It was not romance, not in the conventional sense, but it was love of a kind. The deep, abiding recognition of someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stand beside you anyway. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting amber pools along the sidewalk. Inside, Marcus and Elena remained at the corner table, their coffee growing cold, their silence comfortable and full. The trajectory of both their lives had changed the moment he asked and she answered, and neither would trade that change for the certainty of who they had been before. The announcement surprised no one who had been watching closely, though it still made headlines in the business sections of newspapers that track such things. Marcus Chen, tech entrepreneur and founder of one of the region's most successful venture capital firms, was stepping back from daily operations to dedicate himself full-time to the Chun Foundation Community Fund. The press release was carefully worded, emphasizing continuity and strategic vision, but those who knew Marcus understood what the decision really meant. He was choosing purpose over prestige, impact over empire. The transition took months to execute properly. Marcus appointed a successor he trusted, restructured his holdings to ensure financial stability, and quietly divested from partnerships that no longer aligned with his values. It was not a dramatic exit but a deliberate one, each decision made with the kind of thoughtfulness that had become his new default. His colleagues responded with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Some understood, others thought he was wasting his potential, and a few wondered privately if he had lost his edge. But Marcus no longer measured himself by their opinions. He had found a different metric for success, one that could not be quantified in quarterly reports. Elena's path was different but parallel. The scholarship she received from the fund's education program, a program she had helped design with careful attention to covering not just tuition but living expenses, books, childcare, and all the hidden costs that made higher education inaccessible, allowed her to return to school after nearly a decade away. She enrolled in a graduate program in social entrepreneurship, studying in the evenings after her work with the fund, and the experience of being a student again felt both foreign and deeply right. She was older than most of her classmates, and her perspectives, shaped by years of lived experience rather than theoretical frameworks, often challenged her professors in ways that enriched the discussions. She no longer saw herself as someone whose education had been interrupted, but as someone whose education had simply taken a different route. They worked together almost daily now, their roles clearly defined but fluid. Marcus handled the financial architecture and investor relations, using his credibility and connections to grow the fund's reach. Elena managed community engagement and impact assessment, ensuring that every dollar deployed created measurable change for the people it was meant to serve. They complemented each other in ways that made the work stronger, and their partnership had a rhythm that felt effortless even when the challenges were complex. The fund grew steadily, not explosively. New investors came in, some drawn by Marcus's track record, others by the model Elena had helped pioneer, which prioritized transparency and community input over paternalistic charity. They expanded beyond housing and education into healthcare access, legal aid for immigrants, and support for formerly incarcerated people re-entering the workforce. Each initiative was designed with the same philosophy: Wealth was not the goal. Impact was. Success was measured not by returns on investment but by lives stabilized, opportunities created, and systems made more just. There were moments when people asked if Marcus and Elena were together, their closeness interpreted through the lens of romance because that was the narrative people understood. But they were not a couple, and neither felt the need to become one. What they had was deeper than romance and more durable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that they were better together than apart. They were collaborators in the truest sense, advocates for a vision they had built from a single honest conversation, and friends bound by purpose rather than proximity. On a Saturday morning in early spring, nearly 2 years after Marcus had first walked into Myra's place, they stood together in the community room of the first building the fund had preserved. The space was filled with residents, local business owners, scholarship recipients, and the small army of people whose lives had been touched by the work they had done. There was no formal program, no speeches, just a gathering to celebrate what had been built and to imagine what might come next. Daniel was there, home from university for the weekend, and he introduced Marcus and Elena to his engineering classmates with a pride that made Elena's chest tighten. Rosa, whose restaurant had expanded into 2 locations, brought tamales for everyone, and the room filled with the scent of masa and conversation. Marcus watched Elena move through the crowd, stopping to listen to a grandmother's story, to admire a child's drawing, to ask a young man about his job search, and he felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with alignment. This was what success looked like when it was measured honestly, not wealth accumulated but dignity restored, not power consolidated but opportunities distributed. Elena found him standing by the window, looking out at the street where children played and neighbors greeted each other by name, and she stood beside him without speaking for a moment. They had learned the value of comfortable silence, the way presence could communicate what words could not. "Do you remember what you asked me that first day?" Elena said finally, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "Every word," Marcus replied. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "About what I would do with $10 million. And I realized we've been doing it. Not with 10 million, but with however much we can gather and deploy well. We've been building the answer together." Marcus nodded, feeling the truth of it settle over him like a weight he was grateful to carry. "I was looking for something authentic," he said. "Something real in a world that felt increasingly hollow. And you gave me that. Not just in your answer, but in everything that followed." "You gave me something too," Elena said, turning to look at him. "You gave me proof that people can change. That wealth doesn't have to corrupt. That power can be used to build rather than extract. I didn't think that was possible before I met you." They stood together at the window, watching the community they had helped preserve continue its ordinary, extraordinary life. The fund would grow, the work would expand, and there would be setbacks and compromises and moments of doubt. But the foundation was solid, built on honesty and mutual respect and a shared belief that a single question, asked with sincerity and answered with depth, could alter the course of 2 lives and ripple outward to touch countless others. Marcus no longer measured success by profit margins, and Elena no longer defined herself by survival. They had built something together that neither could have created alone. A legacy rooted in dignity, equity, and the radical idea that how we use our resources matters more than how much we accumulate. It was not the story either had expected to live, but it was the story they had chosen, question by question, decision by decision, conversation by conversation. And in the warm light of that community room, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work, they knew with quiet certainty that it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.